And every friend, colleague, and neighbor had a brother, a husband, or a son going to fight. Quite simply, every Coloradan, for that matter every American, was fixated on the war. And the antagonistic letters kept coming, so too did the telegrams, and the editorials kept berating him. And Ralph Carr's phones kept ringing. And I'm not talking about his phone inside the governor's office on the first floor of the state capitol. I'm talking about Ralph Carr's home phone number. He was listed in the Denver City Directory in the early part of 1942. He always told his teenage kids who begged him to disconnect the line, "The rich and powerful," he said, "always know how to get a hold of you. But if you're going to be the governor, you've got to give the common man a chance to call after an honest day's work." Well, they called all right. He couldn't escape it. Coloradans sincerely believed that the next attack would be closer to home, and that that attack would be aided by people of Japanese descent. That's because the government and the media had convinced them that the attack that killed thousands of Americans at Pearl Harbor was aided by Japanese spies living in the United States. A court of public opinion didn't wait for evidence. It delivered its verdict immediately. The governor's files at the state archives are teeming with examples of that fear and that anger. He told one of his college friends he was being cussed in Colorado about as often as he was being discussed in Colorado. People of Japanese descent were called yellow devils on the front pages of newspapers like the Denver Post. Now, roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent lived on the West Coast in the early part of 1942, a majority of whom were American citizens. But those who contacted Governor Carr did not differentiate between citizen and non-citizen. "We don't want Denver overrun by the yellow race," read one letter to the governor. A homemaker from Boulder pleaded with him. "May God of heaven speak to your soul," she wrote. "No one wants Japanese here to see our bodies ravished and raped by the very devil himself." One farmer sent a telegram suggesting that anyone of Japanese descent simply be killed. Now, as if the anecdotes weren't enough, Ralph Carr actually had poll results sitting on his desk from a survey that had been conducted at the University of Denver. And across the board, men and women, young and old, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, answered by a more than 2-to-1 margin that they looked more unfavorably toward the Japanese than they did toward the Germans and the Italians, Americans' other enemies in World War II. Again, they did not differentiate between American citizens of Japanese descent and those who weren't. And neither, frankly, did Governor Carr's political peers. Kansas Governor Payne Ratner said, quote, "Japs are not wanted and not welcome in Kansas." And he said he would call up his National Guard to ensure that they didn't cross the border. Wyoming Governor Nell Smith worried the Japanese would overrun his state if they were given an opportunity. Wyoming residents, he said, quote, "have a dislike of any Orientals." Further, he said if anyone of Japanese descent were sent to the state of Wyoming, this is the governor, mind you, he said they would be, quote, "found hanging from every pine tree." Even Earl Warren, who many people argue is the greatest advocate for civil rights in U.S. Supreme Court history, even Earl Warren was terrified. As California's Attorney General at the time, he was asked about evacuating the West Coast of anyone with Japanese blood in them, and he said, quote, "American-born Japanese are a menace." So in this environment, you can imagine the reaction then when Colorado's governor says publicly, "To the American-born citizen of Japanese parentage, we look for example and guidance, and we offer the hand of friendship, secure in the knowledge that they will be as truly American as the rest of us." To come from a governor would have been significant enough, but this was no ordinary governor. Even though he'd been in elected office just 3 years, he was one of the sought-after speakers on the National Republican Party circuit. He was an outspoken opponent of the New Deal, an outspoken opponent of big government. He traveled the country, speaking to thousands of people in Dallas and Detroit, New York and Los Angeles. And he charmed newspaper columnists who loved the Western philosophies that he would bring to them. So, for example, he tells a group of reporters in Los Angeles, the way to balance the budget is to stop spending when the money's gone. Tells the New York Times the way to save taxpayers' money is to stop spending taxpayers' money. They loved it and they were fawning all over him. Front pages of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. He was keeping the company of people like former President Herbert Hoover, NBC radio announcer Lowell Thomas, who was arguably the second most popular individual in the country at that time, behind FDR. And the man who would offer him the chance to run for vice president in 1940, that would be Wendell Willkie. It was an opportunity Ralph Carr turned down to continue to try and reform Colorado state government. Ralph Carr, folks, was being talked about in the national newspapers as a future presidential candidate. Not many people even get mentioned in that conversation. His political star was rising at breakneck speed, and then came Pearl Harbor and Ralph Carr's stand on behalf of Japanese Americans. A stand where he proclaimed, if the principles of the Constitution are not preserved for every man, then we shall not have it to protect any man. The governor of a landlocked state quickly found himself isolated on a political island. Ralph Carr believed, as Teddy Roosevelt believed, there was no room in this country for a hyphenated American. That a country of Irish Americans, Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans, what have you, needed to identify with their similarities of being an American, rather than highlighting their ethnic differences. Ralph Carr fondly referred to the melting pot of the United States and said shortly after Pearl Harbor on statewide radio, he personally would not judge the loyalty of any American based on where their grandparents were born. He would tell audiences the Constitution starts out by saying, we the people of the United States. It does not say, we the people who are descendants of the English, or the Scandinavians, or the French. It says, we the people of the United States. And the point that he made over and over to all parts of the state of Colorado in 1942 was that he was not standing up for Japanese Americans. He was standing up for all Americans. And if American citizens of any descent were deprived of their freedom and placed into an internment camp with no evidence of wrongdoing and no trial to determine guilt, what's to say 6 months from now, Ralph Carr would say, that the rest of us would not follow them into that same internment camp with no evidence of wrongdoing and no trial to determine guilt. If society allowed, he believed, for American citizens of any descent to lose their rights as citizens under the Constitution, then the principles of the document that Ralph Carr revered more than any other but the Bible would have been violated and lost. Principles, Ralph Carr was fond of saying, are as true as truth and will last as long as God's creation. And because of that belief, you have likely never heard of him before today. He is a footnote in a time period celebrated by volumes. The parallels you're probably thinking to yourself right now to what's going on today are quite frankly a bit eerie. 60-plus years after World War II, what fascinated me as a reporter is that we are still asking the exact same questions in this society. How do we balance personal privacy versus public safety? How do we survive in a world where we know there are people out there who want to hurt us, who will not follow the same moral and legal code that we follow? What's the role of a government during a time of war? And how do we handle a rising immigrant population? Yet I'd like to think we've learned some lessons from our past. For example, we did not uproot large populations of Arab Americans after 9/11, and we didn't call them derogatory names on the front pages of our papers. And yet we are still asking this fundamental question: what personal price are we each willing to pay for fear? In 2008, without question, the world has changed and the threats are different. But to know the daily sacrifices of World War II Americans, you would be hard-pressed to say that America